Hi, welcome to the Sustainable Advantages Climate Innovators Series. I'm here with Emma Greer from Climateflux. And Emma, why don't you tell us about what you do at Climateflux?
Sure. I am the in-house climate action strategist at Climateflux, which is a environmental consulting group based in Munich.
Cool. And so at Climateflux, like what is that role? Like, what do you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Most days, I'm trying to align the services that we offer with what cities and urban practitioners need. So I look at the policies or the urban planning strategies and try to see how our solutions can help cities and the people who shape and understand and design cities go towards a more resilient and livable direction. So I'm essentially aligning services with kind of the recognized standards for sustainable urban development.
Okay. Yeah. So you kind of like greasing the wheels and getting everybody talking to each other that needs to talk to each other. And so how did you get into that? What was kind of your background before you jumped into Climateflux?
My professional background, so to speak, is more in architecture and urban design. So I worked in urban planning and architecture studios for about 10 years between North America. I'm Canadian, but I now live in Italy. So I jumped between Canada, the US, the UK, and Italy for a couple of years. And that was great. I would say the bulk of that time was spent working on at the intersection of cities and technology. So the sort of smart city paradigm or IoT applied to the built environment. And I got a lot of great opportunities to work on kind of global best practices in the smart city space. But over the years, I became a little bit less convinced with that kind of international consulting firm applying their global standards or their global ideas to specific locations and places. So I think for most of us, the pandemic was an important inflection point, or at least a moment to reflect on what we were doing. And I was looking for something closer to climate, how to address the climate challenge in cities using the skill set that I had developed in the world of architecture. So I turned to climate action for cities, and I got in touch through my own professional network with Climateflux, and I really like what they're doing because it is even if it's very data driven and technology centered, the solutions or the outcomes are very much place based and human centered.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I guess it helps when you have a professional network. I think probably most people listening to this don't know what Climateflux is. So maybe you could talk about what they actually are and what's the goal of Climateflux.
Yeah, so Climateflux has has two lines of services, consulting services and research and development services, and both revolve around the urban microclimate. So it was founded by two guys who met at the Technical University of Munich, and both spent some time at MIT in the sustainability lab and the Sensible City Lab. And both of these institutions, so TU Munich and MIT Sensible City Lab, have been responsible for creating a lot of the leading edge tools for understanding and designing buildings and cities from a, let's say, informational design, from a parametric design standpoint. So a lot of the tools we use to understand climate indoors, inside buildings, efficiency, daylighting, et cetera, have come out of these two institutions. So that was kind of setting the stage for what would become Climateflux. And they really emerged as thought leaders in the outdoor urban realm. So thinking about public spaces, your streets, your squares, your bike paths, your parks. There's really a gap there, that there's a lot of tools and a lot of work being done on the indoor environment and the building, but very little understood and tools being developed for those outdoor urban spaces. And that's really where Climateflux comes in. And again, their work pertains to research and development, so developing workflows and tools for understanding and shaping those outdoor spaces, but also technical consulting projects. So providing advice to people who shape those spaces. And those might be policymakers, but they're also landscape designers, architects, urban planners, real estate developers, regional governments, etc.
Okay, so Climateflux might be selling some services or even some tools and data collection tools, especially to pretty much anybody who's making a built environment, right? Like a government or municipality could be making policy, but also you might have buildings that they're making, and then real estate developers might just want to make a nice feeling outdoor environment, and might use the consultancy.
Yeah, it changes from space to pace. Germany is our largest market, so there's definitely influence from both the private and public sector. If you go to places like Singapore, for example, it's heavily driven by the private sector, or by the public sector rather. And you'll go to another city that, Dubai, for instance, their quote unquote public outdoor environment is largely developed by private developers.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
it changes. Your target audience will change based on the city that you're looking at.
Right. And that's kind of what we experienced a little bit when I brought you over to look at the Cary, North Carolina, and we mostly talked with policymakers because they're driving policy for private developers to develop stuff later on. It's kind
Exactly.
of the workflow. So one of the things like that I think is most interesting about Climateflux are these climate walks. Do you want to kind of walk through what that is a little bit and talk about how that's a little different than how people normally look at the urban microclimate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy that you flagged this project because it's certainly one that I is very close to my heart and is very much part of my day-to-day job is finding the market for this really exciting solution. And again, this is a project that became a service. It really rolled out of the academic roles that the two founders had at TU Munich, and a lot of the research and development that went into it was done in those academic settings. But essentially, Climate Walks is a participatory process for building citizen-powered data ecosystems around microclimate. So engaging citizens in collectively understanding and mapping the microclimate conditions specific to their neighborhood. And that's different from the status quo in that typically we are using satellite data of a city to understand the general climate conditions, for instance, heat mapping using Landsat data. And that really doesn't capture the granularity of the microclimate in the urban environment. There's so much variability in material and massing. So you can't generalize microclimate conditions outside your door with ones 2 blocks over. It varies immensely. And it also varies from person to person. I might be fine in 35 degrees weather, and maybe Dustin, that's way too hot for you. Maybe your air conditioning wasn't working last night and you're already heat stressed before you leave the front door. So there's a range of factors that go into how each of us individually experiences the urban microclimate. And the Climate Walks process takes both into consideration. So basically, it's formatted around walking tours. So you get a group of people together, can be community members, policymakers, designers, local community groups, and you go on a walk or on a cycle carrying this portable weather station. So you're collecting that highly granular, high resolution microclimate data in that neighborhood along a route. And at the same time, the participants are submitting their experienced climate conditions through a web-based survey. So you're collecting both that kind of objective reading of climate at a very, again, high resolution level, and you're collecting data on how individuals perceive the built environment and how they're experiencing the microclimate. And this information then really sets the stage for making decisions about how we can create more comfortable outdoor environments that consider how each of us individually are experiencing the city. So it's a great way for urban practitioners and policymakers to kick off a heat resilient strategy, for example, or a active transportation plan in a specific neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, so to me that's like a cool data collection that there's really no substitute for, right? Like you have to go and do the hard work to get 15, 20 people on a walking tour behind you with like a phone, you know, saying I feel terrible right now, I feel okay right now, and match that up with the data. Especially here in North Carolina, the difference between shade and sun is extremely large, especially in the summertime. And so that's why I thought it was a pretty interesting, a pretty interesting project, because you get this data that you really just can't collect unless you actually have boots on the ground, walking your normal kind of route that you would take. You know, if I'm going to build mixed use development somewhere and I expect these people in these apartments or townhouses to be able to walk to the grocery store, well, maybe I want to walk that route and see if maybe I should put some more trees in or something like that. And that, I think that's excellent. So a question more like to the business side of Climateflux, would you call it a mission-driven business, or is it more like a for-profit business? Like how would you characterize Climateflux at this point?
Well, we're definitely a for-profit company, but with high, we set the bar pretty high in terms of prioritizing impact and holding ourselves to, you know, really evidence-based recommendations of the highest quality. We're not going out there saying we can do this whole mixed bag of services. It's quite a focused set of services that are on the leading edge of the science, coming from that academic sphere that it kind of emerged. And I think while there's the ambition to grow quickly, we're looking for the types of clients that can take that insight and deliver action on the ground. And we've been quite selective in that respect.
Yeah, you're not looking to just sell consulting services and then move on to the next thing. You want to actually see people follow through with the actions that have been kind of recommended or something like that. But at the same time, you're not doing it for free. It's not a philanthropic endeavor on its own. You think there's actually a market where people who live in the areas that have been built using some of these concepts that Climateflux is putting out there in the consultancy will actually be happier and demand it in other places. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and I think the Climate Walks project is really just such a great example of that, because I mean, the core value proposition at the end of the day is the data. It's an analysis. You're flagging vulnerable areas or problematic areas from a microclimate standpoint that then whoever the recipient is can then act on it or not. And the community engagement component per se isn't, excuse me, isn't strictly necessary. It adds a layer of data, again, that sort of subjective reading of climate. But more than anything, it builds consensus.
Sorry. Take a minute. I will do some post editing, so you can feel free to take some time.
My kids are always sick.
I understand. You may be hearing one of mine in the background right now. Not sure.
We're on cold number 2, and it's the only the end of January this year.
That's there's more to come.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
It never ends. We got terrible air quality in Milan as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I don't know if you look at the Apple air quality on your weather app,
Mm-hmm.
if you use an iPhone, but it's always on the extremely poor.
Oh no.
Okay, I think we're good.
Okay.
Maybe should I backtrack to Climateflux is a really good example of this.
Yes, let's do that. That'll make it
I've got a
easier for
few
you to
more
find it.
I've got a few more coughs in here.
Okay, you're good. I asked you to talk a lot, so you were like, yeah.
Yeah, I've been at my computer silently typing all day, so this is the first bout of continuous
Right.
chat that I've had this day. Okay, I think we're good.
Okay.
I'll go back
Yes.
to Climateflux. Yeah, and I think
Okay.
Climateflux is actually a really great example of this. The participatory aspect of that now service offering isn't strictly necessary for the main value proposition, which is the data. I mean, that you're collecting through this mobile weather station. But both in addition to that subjective layer of data, it's really, it has a huge impact in terms of building consensus around a new initiative, just getting people in a room, talking about a project, talking about what could be improved in their neighborhood, does a lot to move that needle from just pure insight to action and inclusive action that incorporates ideas and the needs of the individuals who actually live in that community.
Right. It's like a nice little community push
Yeah.
that it starts to drive, because nobody likes to be miserable when they're walking around outside. I think that's a pretty consensus opinion, but at the same time, when they look at the trade-offs of what you're going to have in order to make that happen, this kind of starts that conversation, which I think is good.
It moves you from the not in my backyard to yes in my backyard.
Yeah,
kind of mantra.
exactly. Because some of the stuff, it isn't that hard to do, but you have to get it in place. So just kind of thinking about forward at Climateflux, what would you say kind of holds up growth, or where you want to go with the company? Is it more like just get to operations? Is there some product market fit that you're trying to explore? Like, what is it, are people kind of resistant to the ideas? So you have to do a little bit more work to grease the wheels. What would you say is kind of the biggest holdup?
There's a lot of milestones in our growth strategy. It's really such a remarkable story. It's almost as if the solutions appeared without a clear understanding of the problem to a certain respect. They found a natural market. We've made assumptions about the value that we assume people have found in our work as they continue to come to us, at the beginning with very little, let's say, intentional business development. And now we're kind of in that stage of saying, do our clients, past, present, and future, really value what we think they value, or are they seeing something else? that we're not yet capitalizing on in terms of marketing and business development. So understanding ourselves is definitely one of those milestones. Here in Europe, there's a remarkable amount of funding, not so unlike the IRA funding that's come out recently in the US, but the European Commission has been very generous, very intentional, and with its grants. And a lot of, for instance, the research and development work that we do is funded by European, national, regional, and even local funding. And that has really allowed us to test and to work with a diverse set of stakeholders. For instance, to work with sociologists and anthropologists on the Climate Walks initiative, to test solutions for bikers and pedestrians to find the most comfortable outdoor path using AI-driven microclimate modeling. So we've been able to do a lot of experimentation with that R&D vertical. I think moving forward, we would like to really push on the consulting side, and for that very reason that we want to move from insight to action. We want to work with the people who have the levers to improve the built environment, especially those kind of lovable public spaces that make our cities great places to be. Yeah, I would say that's the big push right now, is to really sprint ahead with the consulting work and to continue to develop partnerships with other fields that can give us new perspectives on this theme of the urban microclimate.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's like kind of what's coming next. Is you feel decent about the technology and the data side, but want to keep experimenting and then kind of keep getting boots on the ground on consulting. I think that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Yeah.
I'm glad you think so.
But
well, as you know, you've been instrumental in helping us test some of those value propositions. So big thanks to you, Dustin.
Yeah, I'm trying. I think it's a really interesting project. I really like the Climate Walk stuff, and I encourage anybody listening to this to go check out Climateflux, check out their Climate Walks project, and it's not that hard to get it into your city and get people to start thinking about it. You kind of have more power than you think you do, especially if you live in the United States. So Emma, I appreciate talking to me today, and we'll chat again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dustin.